Okay, great. So it's time to get started. Hi, everyone. Welcome, and thank you again for joining us. My name is Stephanie, and I manage the marketing here at Hawk Partners. Today, our very own Alex Ain and Amy Weiser, both partners here, who specialize in qualitative research, will be sharing their perspectives on how to enhance the value of your digital research engagements, including the impact of COVID on research, best practices for applying digital technologies, along with a few case studies. So if you have questions at any point during the presentation, please submit through the Q&A or the chat function, and we'll do our best to answer your questions in real time. We'll also have a dedicated portion at the end of the webinar for Q&A. So if for some reason we're unable to get to your questions, we will be sure to answer them at the very end. So without further ado, I will pass it over to Alex and Amy to get us started.
All right, thank you everyone for joining. A good way to think about digital is to ask, how do we add value through digital, as opposed to asking, how can digital be a substitute for in-person research? And we've been applying digital for years prior to the pandemic and believe it's not just a substitute for in-person. And in many circumstances, digital is actually better. It can fit the objectives better. It allows for reach up to specific populations. It can address budgetary issues, condense timelines, and result in really distinct and valuable insights. So today we'll discuss how to create value with digital and still replicate and even build on several of the key approaches that are used in-person. One of the things we want to discuss is several overarching or high-level best practices that we've learned from our years of doing digital prior to the pandemic and even because of the pandemic. First, let the business objectives drive the methodology. One of the key things that we've learned is that by being platform and approach agnostic, meaning that we won't recommend a specific platform or approach until fully understanding clients' business objectives, target audiences, and other contextual factors that allow our clients to expand the reach of their engagement, we're able to fit the right technique, the right platform, and oftentimes combinations of those to generate valued insights. Also, keeping it simple. It's easy to get complex with digital. There's a lot of space in which you can get creative and try different things. However, the most successful projects tend to keep the user experience and the exercises for respondents simple and intuitive and easy. And that facilitates on our end as moderators better discussion and drives deeper insights. Also, keeping it real. Whenever possible, replicate relevant environment and context for the respondent. So test your apps on phones, test websites and online experiences and interchanges where you expect them to happen. And digital affords us that opportunity to do so. Also, plan for the unexpected. We find our clients often benefit most from the unexpected behaviors and ideas that emerge in digital research. So we work closely throughout the projects with the field, with our clients, to be able to adapt on the fly. And then lastly, keep your respondents engaged. Everybody is fatigued with being online. We're in an environment right now where most of us are online and plugged in longer than we were prior to the pandemic. So creative approaches and exercises really do work well to break that fatigue that could be associated with being online and conducting or participating in research digitally.
So throughout our webinar today, we're going to touch on a variety of methodologies and tools that can be utilized digitally, all of which, we tailor based on a project or the engagement's core objective. So up on the screen, you'll see several examples that we're going to touch on a bit more depth through our conversation today. There are others out there. We just wanted to highlight a few during the webinar. And you can keep in mind that, you can use one or more of these applications digitally within a single engagement. It just sort of depends on what we're trying to achieve. So we're going to start off with virtual interviews and focus groups. So that's the first area we're going to touch on today. So what are virtual interviews and focus groups? Similar to in-person, except that they're conducted virtually, pretty simple. And they allow for the same interaction between a moderator and either a single or multiple respondents, as well as the same interaction with clients. And so, we've been conducting interviews and groups online for years. Sometimes it can be a better choice depending on the project objective. So if we're trying to achieve greater geographic diversity, or if we're trying to talk to people that are hard to reach populations where it would be really difficult to get a group of folks to come in one city and across, a couple days. And we team with multiple different technology providers to really ensure a seamless experience for both respondents participating as well as our clients viewing. So how do virtual interviews and focus groups work? And how do they really add value? So similar to in-person, they allow for moderator and respondents to develop rapport with each other, similar to in-person. If seeing a respondent is really helpful or critical to the objectives, we utilize webcams. They're not always necessary based on the project, and we'll touch on that a little bit later. And with groups, you're able to have those same dynamics that you can develop in person, where respondents can build on insights that others may mention and sort of have that gradual conversation build over time. There are some things that we do to help maximize the value for participants and clients when doing interviews or groups virtually. So we tend to employ pilot days, and that's really intended to help simulate that backroom rapport that we develop with clients that we have in person to really help work out the discussion flow or work out any kinks to stimuli. We also, can plan for debrief. So again, to really make sure that we build in the same dynamics that you have when you do in person. We can share stimuli and we can even build customized tools to share different stimuli based on the techniques we're trying to accomplish. And we also utilize a variety of different exercises, often ones that reflect behavioral economics thinking in order to access system 1 and system 2 thinking. So all the things that you do in person, we also incorporate virtually. One thing to keep in mind sometimes for groups is sometimes we will make them a teeny bit smaller than in person so that, participants online can really rely on the stimulus on the screen to really spur that creation. But again, it's kind of dependent on what you're looking for. Same things that you would consider when doing in person. Are you looking for more depth of response, or are you looking for more breadth, in which having more respondents would be helpful? And then lastly, when it comes to virtual interviews and groups, what insight can they provide? So again, use these in the same scenarios that you would use in-person groups or IDIs. The same reasons that you would select one methodology hold for virtual. Are you doing something in which respondents would be making decisions on their own, or you're trying to tap into that individual point of view in which a one-on-one makes more sense versus when you would employ a group? And otherwise, virtual, online, and groups, they can be part of a larger project, and they can work as an extension of an online discussion platform, which we'll talk about a little bit later. They can be part of a larger engagement that has both quantitative and qualitative aspects, so they don't need to be, just a single method used for a larger engagement. So up on the screen is just an example of, how online research can look in action. The examples that you're seeing right now are primarily groups. But it would be similar for, a one-on-one interview where you would see a moderator and the individual respondent if utilizing webcam. To the right, you'll see an example where we were displaying a video and obtaining reactions to the video live from the group. There's a variety of types of stimuli and ways we can share it, whether it's static versus, a PowerPoint or PDF, or something that's more interactive, like a video. There's also a variety of different platforms, and we really tend to match those with what are the core objectives for the project, what will make for the most seamless interaction with respondents. And most of the platforms, they really enable for sort of seamless client and respondent interactions through the interface. So clients can view what the respondent is seeing, they can interact with colleagues, they can interact with the moderator and pose questions in a sort of a backroom simulated chat area. And they're doing this from the comfort of their home, and anything that they post, respondents wouldn't see. So again, it sort of helps to facilitate that backroom feeling. And you can also see exactly what respondents are seeing on the screen as they navigate through the stimuli. And then what's also nice is you can watch live, or you can have digital recordings sent to you after the fact. So lastly, when it comes to web-enabled interviews or focus groups, there's a couple best practices that we wanted to highlight. So first and foremost is content and activities. So similar to what you might do in person, you sometimes need to modify activities appropriately for the online setting. And this is really the goal, to minimize any time spent explaining instruction to respondents and really maximize that discussion time. So, the ways in which, if you're doing a focus group and you're writing things up on a wall, so you're minimizing, instructions. Again, you think about those things when you're crafting things for online. If we're going to assign homework exercises, when that's appropriate, we'll have respondents share them ahead of time so that we can take those additional insights and add that to the depth of exploration and not waste time during the sessions themselves. And then for group dynamics, for focus groups, as mentioned, sometimes we recommend slightly fewer respondents, potentially up to 6, and this really helps to enable deeper conversation and richer insights for groups. We employ techniques to facilitate the group interaction the same way we would do in person, though when appropriate, we'll tailor that for online. So an example that would be specific to virtual is, sometimes we may turn off our camera to sort of encourage respondents to interact with one another rather than address only the moderator. And that helps respondents kind of discuss their contrasting points of view amongst themselves and sort of delve in and probe into each other's individual responses. And then preparation. As far as virtual is concerned, we screen respondents to ensure that they have access and comfort with any platform or technology we may be using. We tech test them to make sure they're equipped to participate. If we need to screen share, other elements are required, so there's no wasting time during setup. Similarly, we'll have them log on early. And then, as mentioned, we try to conduct pilot days as much as possible to work out sort of any issues. And then lastly, engagement. So, as moderators, we've developed deep expertise and a toolkit to sort of keep respondents engaged throughout the discussion. We work with, teams in advance to optimize, again, that backroom experience. We can develop custom exercises to engage respondents specifically to what might work better virtually, as well as with our clients to help enhance that team participation. We can set up exercises to keep them engaged as well.
So Amy, we actually just had a quick question come in.
Sure.
It's regarding recruitment. Is there a specific population that's more difficult to recruit for when you're conducting sessions virtually versus in person?
So I'll start this response, and Alex, obviously feel free to jump in. I would say no. We've been conducting research for years virtually before the pandemic. And in some ways it can actually aid in reaching populations that are harder to find, especially now that everyone's home. So, a population that might be hard to find in person may be also hard to find online, just if they're not, people that you would necessarily do research in. But as far as being more difficult, I would say no. And in some ways it's a benefit to doing it virtually because, again, if you're trying to talk to a very specific type of consumer or a very rare patient type, often it's easier to get, reach them geographically across the country and do it from the comfort of their home.
And we recently had a client ask us the same exact question relative to their project. And interestingly, they were very concerned about, because it was a UX test, they were very concerned about the availability of broadband across the entire population of consumers with which they wanted to test a user experience. And we tracked this with several hundred respondents that we recruited. Very many of them were, because of the type of consumer we were looking for, very many of them were in the older age range. And we found 0 cases of anybody who was limited because of tech or their comfort with tech across several hundred potential respondents. So we really feel like the vast majority of respondent types we can recruit.
And that being said, just to add one last thing, we're keeping a pulse on it. We have very good relationships with the recruit partners. So if there are particular populations due to the pandemic, that might be more or less challenging based on what's going on in certain states or cities. That's something that we're keeping a pulse on, but not something that we've seen really been affected.
Great, thank you.
All right. When it comes to online discussions, online discussion platforms serve as a vehicle by which we can execute many different types of approaches. We often get asked, can we do an online bulletin board? Can we set up a community? Can we do ethnography digitally? And often we get the idea that people are thinking the platform is specifically designed for executing one type of technique. And the thing to remember is these are very dynamic. These are ecosystems and environments where we can undertake multiple approaches, whether it is bulletin boards, diaries, ethnographies, communities. And sometimes we can do elements of multiple within the same engagement. And the way it benefits clients is it really fosters a dynamic environment to obtain feedback. We can iterate discussion over a short or long period of time. We can talk to individuals or groups of respondents within a single engagement. So rather than think of it as a technique or a platform approach, think of it as kind of a playground where we can think through these things together and add value to research because of that. Online discussion platforms, they tend to enable us to question and probe and interact with respondents to very efficiently produce a wide range of feedback on multiple topics. They're great for longitudinal studies. They're great for studies that have distinct phases or cover many topics, because each activity or each day within a participation for an online discussion platform can represent a new theme or a new topic area for exploration. And that flexibility allows us to collect rich and very distinct insights, often through customized activities. And these engagements really can be iterative. We can introduce stimulus to respondents early on in the activity and in the engagement. That stimulus can be tested and we can learn from that. We can make changes and then reintroduce it. And that really generates highly actionable feedback. So I know it can be kind of confusing to say, let's just approach this as a platform. And what are the different things that we think about when helping to figure out what are the different approaches, what are the different platforms that we want to use? So we consider a number of very interrelated factors to choose an optimal or even combination of approaches and platforms. You can see we consider things like the respondent groups and subgroups. How much respondent engagement is there in the category? Do we want individual and group reaction? All of these things are then considered to match with different approaches that we want to conduct, as well as on which platform or platforms we want to conduct them. And clients are able to be much more efficient with their time, with their budgets, and they still can uncover very unique and relevant ways to address complex marketing issues using these online discussion platforms. And through our experience, we've learned a number of best practices. The first is people. Think about the respondents when we do these, as well as their role and how they generate insights. We as moderators love to engage with the respondents individually before they even start through the messaging systems that are built into these platforms. And that ensures they're comfortable with us, they're comfortable with the project, and they're comfortable sharing even with each other later on. We allow them to choose aliases. Oftentimes that makes respondents feel safer and respond more openly. And then we think about the segments and the subsegments of interest to facilitate discussions and sorting of responses in advance. And that uncovers unique themes and insights during the course of an online platform engagement. The second is timing and guidelines. Be clear on the amount of time that is required. This speaks to both the activities and the total time commitment for respondents, and then establishing a clear purpose and objective for the activities and also the entire engagement for respondents and also for clients, helping them to understand what their role is going to be in the online interactions and discussions is critical as well. And then establishing guardrails for discussions keeps people focused. It keeps them polite and interacting with each other in a meaningful way, as opposed to letting them kind of free flow and taking up their time with less meaningful conversation. Be open to ideas. Think about these in discussions and ideas for discussions that need to happen individually or in groups, and have that idea going in. And speaking back to planning for the unexpected, be open to and plan for the possibility of hot button or issues or discussions. Being able to react in the moment in these online discussion platforms often produces some of our best insights. And if you want to go as far as having an ideation session built in, we can create very actionable results by building in ideation sessions within these discussions and online platforms. And lastly, stimuli and logistics. Think about how, if, when stimulus is introduced. The online discussion platforms oftentimes present an opportunity that we would never get with in person, which is allowing respondents to live with a concept or an idea. So we can introduce it very early on in the discussion, iterate, don't iterate, and let them live with the idea. And that adds value because you're getting repeated exposure and down the road thinking that you normally may not get with an in-person approach. Allow the respondents to submit various types of thoughts and ideas through text, through images, through videos. The more and the different approaches, you're going to get different insights as a result. And then consider diary or ethnography exercises in combination with discussion to deepen findings. You can learn a lot about the context in which an idea functions just by asking the respondent to film an element of their life and then post it on the online discussion platform for us to, as moderators, to interact and discuss.
So now we're going to talk about some of the different digital tools. So there's a variety of different methods, approaches, and tools to virtual research, a lot of which in the past you really only primarily conducted in person, but now clients can benefit from conducting research by leveraging ours or other digital tools. So up on the screen, you'll see several areas from, basic marketing communication testing to UX research. You can also conduct simulated interactions between two groups, such as, Salesforce and a customer, a broker and a prospect, a sales rep and a physician, and you can utilize these digital tools to mimic those interactions. And so we're briefly just going to highlight a couple of these and how they work. So the first one that we're going to touch on is a message testing tool. So years ago at Hawk Partners, we developed a proprietary virtual message testing tool to mimic the in-person experience. So historically, it's a card sorting exercise and a hierarchy activity. There's typically lots of paper when you're doing it in person, and respondents are moving it around in front of them. But so our tool, it enables for respondents to sort of digitally drag and drop and consider the messages that are in front of them. So in real time, you can watch respondents. There's a flexibility in terms of how the messages are presented. It can include visuals as well as how many are presented, how they're windowed, and really the output and benefit is to help our clients teams understand sort of which messages are effective, which groups of messages are most effective, and in what order or flow should the story be told. So we're not going to get into too many specifics of exactly how the tool works. You can see a brief example up on the screen, but really just want to emphasize that this is something that can be very easily completed online, and is not something that has to be done in person anymore.
All right, and facial coding is another way that we can add value to digital research. If you think of any kind of concept test, yes, we're going to be asking them about their reactions to it, but because we're doing this digitally, we can use the webcams that are embedded within their computers to, we can use the webcams that are embedded within their computers to learn more about their reactions to a certain level of stimulus. The webcams record the muscle movements within the respondent's face as they're reacting to something, and then we can go back and analyze and code those responses and add depth to the reaction and the response that we get from a typical concept test or reaction to any kind of visual stimulus that we share with them.
And then the last area that we wanted to highlight as far as digital tools or methods is around UX or usability, user experience. So, it's possible to obtain those same rich insights that you would achieve through in person when you test in a usability lab through virtual UX testing. And what it does and the value it provides is it enables for sort of real-time screen sharing, whether you're going to be testing a mobile app or mobile website or a desktop website, whether it's a prototype, a live, or a native app. And so we've been testing websites and prototypes remotely for years, but historically it was much more challenging and limiting to do that for mobile apps or mobile websites. And more recently, there's been a variety of different technology providers that enable to test those mobile sites and mobile apps from the comfort of a consumer's home. And so that constraint to in-person, you now have the flexibility to conduct online. And again, you can see what the respondent is doing. You can watch them on the screen or watch them actually on their own particular mobile device. So now we want to highlight some real world examples and case studies where we've employed some of these different tools or techniques. And the first one that we want to highlight is a project in which it turned out that virtual was better and better served the project objective. So the goal of this research was for a leading rideshare and food delivery platform where we were conducting monthly research, typically on early or later stage concepts or designs, often prototypes, or again, sort of concepts. And it was initially designed for these monthly in situ or in situation in-person sessions, just partially due to client preference, where we would physically go to the consumer or customer's place of business. And we quickly realized after the first day or first round and sort of recommended to the client that we actually think virtual might be a better choice, and for two primary reasons. So first is it was better methodologically. Since we were often reviewing prototypes or materials that didn't really require in-person review, and it was actually easier for clients to interact with the moderator and see what the respondent was doing if we were conducting it virtually, since when we were in person, we weren't in a traditional facility. The other key reason was due to the geographic diversity. So the interviews we were conducting were in one major metropolitan center, and by doing it remotely, we could reach a much larger, greater geographic diversity that would capture, a more representative respondent universe for the client. And ultimately, it was providing them with more diverse and better insights to the team. This particular project took place in New York City. That's a very specific market, and again, doesn't represent all of their customers. And around both the country as well as the globe.
Right. A second example of putting some of these principles in practice by which we can add value to digital research was for a global social media client that wanted to identify strategies and approaches to enhance the search and consumption of video. That's a very, very, very broad business objective. And one of the ways we help them to do that is to think through this like we discussed. Multiple approaches using an online discussion platform. some of the things we did, we pushed a survey link to further profile their customer base in a meaningful way. We used ethnographic elements to better understand how video and how search was fit within their overall social media usage. We conducted UX elements with the online discussion tool where we asked respondents to record a search and then probed about elements of how they went about that search. And then we actually tracked their usage and behaviors and perceptions longitudinally through a diary element. And then lastly, we conducted one-on-one interviews, both in the US and globally, with select respondents to really understand the depth to which some of these themes existed and why. And what that allowed us to do is really uncover some rich and distinct insights into these behaviors and perceptions, as well as helping them to better target segments of respondents relative to what they wanted out of search and use of video. We created a number of budgetary and time efficiencies by addressing multiple objectives that were rolled up under that very broad objective where we started. And we generated really distinct and actionable results, both in the near term and long term. We helped them make immediate changes to their UX, as well as uncovered strategic elements by which they could protect and garner a greater share of video consumption. So if we wanted you to remember 3 things today, the first would be objectives really drive the technology and not in the application of technology, not the inverse. When it comes to digital, approaching these engagements with an open mind and an open idea as to what the solution will be is a better approach than trying to predetermine or prescribe a solution first. And then mixing approaches and tools to drive unique and actionable insights is really what allows us to add greater value to digital. And then digital is not a substitute for in-person. It really affords the opportunities that prove effective. And it does open us up to allow for creative approaches and explorations to solve for key marketing questions. It is, we are forced to do things differently given the pandemic. However, our mindset is not that digital is going to, replicate in person. It's going to add value to your engagements. So we'd like to turn it back over to Steph to facilitate questions and answers. And thank you for your time.
Yep. Thank you. So we do have a few questions that have come in and a few that were submitted in advance. And just a reminder to everyone, if you do have any questions, feel free just to add them in the chat or the Q&A function here right on Zoom. So the first question we have is multi-part. It's related to the healthcare industry. So could you share your views on digital research engagements with healthcare professionals versus patients? That's the first part.
Sure, I can start with that, and then Amy, jump in as you'd like. First, in terms of healthcare and patients, we've been doing this digitally with both providers, patients, for a number of years. They all have become more comfortable with the changes in because of the pandemic and how many physicians have had to adopt telemed quickly. We've learned that they're very comfortable participating in this type of research, and the benefit to them is they don't have to necessarily leave their office or their home to participate in this research as well. So we haven't had any limitations per se, either reaching and discussing, even getting participation from either of those two audiences.
And just to add, as Alex mentioned, sorry, there's some feedback. Just to add, as Alex mentioned, we've been doing this for years, and I think we made the point earlier that actually sometimes besides what's going on with telemedicine and physicians being even more comfortable, is again reaching very specific types of specialists or very rare patient types that actually makes it much more accessible to do research virtually than, you know, trying to pick a city where you're hopeful to get, you know, a very rare patient group to fill a day of research.
Okay. And the second part of this question, what are your thoughts on holding joint interviews with a patient and their spouse or partner?
Yeah, yes. The first aspect of that is let's consider the objectives first before we recommend that. But second, we can get creative here as well. If the decision and the objectives warrant it, we don't see any reason not to have a spouse and a patient participate in the same interview. There's some different dynamics it brings to the table. Do you want them on the same webcam? Do we need a webcam? Do they need to be on separate computers? Do you want to use breakout rooms so you can interview each individually? These are all things that we can do pending the objectives. So absolutely, digital affords an opportunity to get creative and add value to that type of project.
Okay. And the last part, in regard to doing digital focus groups, how many is the realistic maximum? Does a dyad or triad work well? Or should we stick to IDIs?
We're going to sound a little bit like a broken record, but again, pending the objectives and based on those, all of those work well. It really is going to come down to what your considerations are. If there's something that's private, IDIs are going to probably work best. If we have a smaller group, we can go deeper. If there's a decision-making component that requires more than one person involved, we might do a dyad or a triad. So in terms of the number of respondents, it's really going to be driven by the objectives, just like it would in person. We really don't see digital as a limiting factor there, as much as an opportunity to think about how do we add value to an engagement or an interaction with the respondent.
Okay, and another question that just came in. We would love to hear your perspective on the pros and cons of using webcams. When do they help? When do they not help?
Sure. There's a whole bunch of things to consider there. Obviously, if you're going to be using a technique that is webcam dependent, like facial coding, that's going to drive whether they're used or not. We find respondents are comfortable either way. We were doing, even doing a UX test this week, respondents' inclination was to turn their webcam on, even though all we were really interested in was sharing their computer screen or their phone screen and interacting that way. So we can learn a lot from facial expressions, much like we do in terms of body language and facial expressions in person. However, if there's a component of embarrassment or anonymity that can come into play in a category or with a respondent, we would recommend either using aliases and asking them if they feel comfortable with a webcam, because it can add value, and or using aliases and not having the webcam. So again, it's going to go back to the objectives and the specific type of respondent and conversation we're about to have. But the key thing is really just to try to create the most comfortable environment for the respondent.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I mean, some of the pros, I don't know if that's me or you, Steph, some of the pros are that when you can see each other, it can help to develop rapport and comfort. And again, to Alex's point, seeing facial expressions. But some of the cons is that you don't want to make someone uncomfortable and or limit who you include in the research if they are uncomfortable. So it's just something to keep in mind when recruiting and considering sort of what is the goal, because you can have really insightful, thoughtful conversations that are deep without a webcam. So it's just dependent on if they add value. And sometimes, I mean, now most of the platforms we use, the webcams you can have a screen where they're large. So if it's really just mostly conversational, but sometimes when you're sharing a lot of stimuli and there's a lot of stuff going on, sometimes it may be helpful to not have the webcam just so that you can maximize the room on the amount of real estate on the screen. But so there's lots of pros and cons to using webcams. It, again, sort of depends on what the objectives are.
Right. And in terms of online discussion platforms, it's incredibly effective to ask respondents to create a video of themselves answering questions rather than text, but we allow them to answer in text as well if they're uncomfortable sharing video. A couple of things, it facilitates them interacting with the questions if they don't have to type, if they're using a webcam to submit a video. But we don't want to limit their participation as a result. So we offer them the option and treat each equally. It really does make for a more comfortable experience for the respondent, which is just going to lead to deeper insights on our end.
Right. And I think that will be our last question. And I think, Alex, you touched on this briefly, but I think it's an important point. Do you think switching to digital for research is trending due to COVID, or is this just where the industry's headed? And do you think there will ever be a point that digital will overtake in person?
Okay, so I have a very distinct perspective on this. This was an acceleration. This was not a takeover. Digital was around and being used for many years, not just a few years prior to the pandemic. COVID accelerated that. However, in-person is going to be here. There's value in in-person research. If there's tactile elements or taste elements or sensory elements, those things can't be replicated through a computer yet. That is going to be an element of research. There's value in having a team together in a back room with the moderators, with the respondents in the other room, and be able to see them. And I mean, quite honestly, we all like to travel, and for the most part, there's good and bad trips, but for the most part, we like to travel. So in-person isn't going anywhere, but the more clients see the value that can be brought to digital, I think the more likely and the more digital is going to get used. The more they see that budget, timing, effectiveness of using digital, the more digital is going to get used. But it's never going to completely replace in person. And it's not going to, and it just was accelerated by the pandemic.
Okay. Thank you. So I think that's the last of the questions that have been submitted. So I just wanted to say thank you to everyone that joined us today. We hope this was a very helpful conversation, informative discussion for you all. If you do have any questions at some point down the road, feel free to reach out to anyone on the Hawk Partners team. And we'll also be following up with everyone in attendance today with a recording of the webinar. So you'll have for safekeeping in the future. So thanks so much and enjoy the rest of your days. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.